In February 1895, two plays by the same writer were running at the same time in London's West End. Both theaters were packed every single night. Audiences laughed until they cried. Critics called him the wittiest man writing in English. That same year, before the year was even over, that same man was standing in a prison cell, sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. His name was Oscar Wilde. And what happened in between his greatest triumph and his total collapse is one of the most dramatic falls in literary history. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly how it happened and why, more than a century later, the world is still trying to make it right. Here is the real question this story will answer. How does a man go from being the most celebrated writer in London to a convicted criminal in the very same year? The short answer involves a lawsuit, a furious father, and a piece of paper with a single misspelled word on it. But to really understand how Oscar Wilde's life came apart so completely and so fast, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to a brilliant, unusual boy growing up in Dublin, Ireland. Oscar Wilde was born on October 16, 1854, in Dublin, Ireland. His parents were both remarkable in their own right. His father, Sir William Wilde, was a highly respected eye and ear surgeon, later knighted for his medical work, and also had a serious interest in Irish folklore and archaeology. His mother, Jane Wilde, wrote poetry and essays under the pen name Speranza, and was known for her passionate support of Irish independence, publishing fiery nationalist writing at a time when doing so carried real personal risk. Growing up in this household, young Oscar was surrounded by literature, ideas, and sharp conversation from an early age. Dinner table conversation in the Wilde household was, by most accounts, as intellectually demanding as any classroom. He proved to be an exceptional student. He studied classics at Trinity College in Dublin, excelling especially in Greek, and then won a scholarship to Magdalen College at Oxford University in England, a major achievement for a young man from Ireland at the time, and one that placed him among England's academic elite. At Oxford, Wilde became known for two things at once: his brilliant academic work and his flamboyant personal style. Flamboyant, showy, colorful, and confident in a way that draws attention. He wore his hair long, dressed dramatically, and openly embraced a philosophy called aestheticism. Aestheticism, the belief that art and beauty are valuable simply for their own sake, not because they teach a lesson or serve a practical purpose. This put him somewhat at odds with the more traditional, buttoned-up culture of Victorian Oxford, though it also made him instantly memorable. In 1878, he won Oxford's prestigious Newdigate Prize for a poem he had written, titled Ravenna, a rare honor that confirmed his genuine literary talent, not just his personality. Wilde left Oxford with real academic honors. But it was his personality, even more than his degree, that people would remember first. After Oxford, Wilde moved to London. And in an unusual twist, he became a celebrity before he had published very much writing at all. His wit, his fashion, and his confident embrace of aestheticism made him a well-known figure in London society. People wanted to be seen with him. Newspapers wrote about him. He was even gently mocked in a popular comic opera of the time, which poked fun at the aesthetic movement he had come to represent so publicly. In 1882, this reputation carried him all the way to America, where he was invited to give a lecture tour explaining aestheticism to American audiences, partly to help promote that same popular opera when it opened in the United States. Upon arriving, he is famously quoted as telling customs officials, "I have nothing to declare except my genius," though some biographers note the exact wording of this famous line may have been polished or invented slightly over the years that followed. The tour itself was a real success, taking him across dozens of American cities over nearly a year. In 1884, Wilde married a woman named Constance Lloyd, an intelligent and independently minded woman in her own right. They had 2 sons together, Cyril and Vivian, born in 1885 and 1886. For a while, by most accounts, the marriage was a genuinely happy one. But it was in the years that followed his marriage that Wilde finally began producing the serious literary work his reputation had promised. And it would make him more famous than he had ever been. In 1890, Wilde published his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, a story about beauty, vanity, and moral corruption that shocked and fascinated readers in equal measure. Some critics at the time called it dangerous and immoral. Others recognized it immediately as a work of real genius. Either way, it made his name impossible to ignore. Then, starting in 1892, Wilde turned his attention to the theater, and this is where he found his greatest success. Lady Windermere's Fan in 1892. A Woman of No Importance in 1893. Both plays were sharp, funny, and hugely popular in London, filled with the kind of quotable, cutting dialogue that Wilde had been perfecting his entire adult life in real conversation. By early 1895, Wilde had two more plays running simultaneously, An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest. Both were considered some of the finest comedies the English stage had ever produced, praised for their wit, their tightly constructed plots, and their gentle mockery of Victorian high society's own rules and hypocrisies. Wilde was, without exaggeration, at the absolute peak of his career. He was arguably the most talked about writer in London, admired by critics and adored by audiences. But during these same years of extraordinary success, Wilde had also formed a relationship that would eventually threaten to destroy everything he had built. Around 1891, Wilde became close with a young aristocrat named Lord Alfred Douglas, often called by his nickname Bosie. Bosie was charming, strikingly handsome, and, by most accounts, also somewhat reckless and demanding. The two men spent significant time together over the following years, traveling and socializing openly enough that their closeness did not go unnoticed within London's social circles. Bosie's father was a powerful and famously hot-tempered nobleman named the Marquis of Queensberry, the same man whose name is still attached to the modern rules of boxing today. Rules he had helped establish decades earlier. Queensberry had a difficult, often volatile relationship with his own son, and his temper was well known throughout London society. Queensberry deeply disapproved of his son's closeness with Wilde. Over time, his disapproval grew into open hostility and eventually into direct, public confrontation, including angry confrontations at Wilde's own home and threats made in person and by letter. In February 1895, at the very height of Wilde's professional success, with two of his plays packing theaters, just streets away, Queensberry left a calling card for Wilde at a private London club. On it, he had written a brief, deeply insulting accusation, misspelling one crucial word in his fury. Wilde, encouraged strongly by Bosie, who had his own long-running resentment toward his father, decided to fight back the only way Victorian society allowed, in court. It would turn out to be the single worst decision of his life. Wilde sued the Marquis of Queensberry for libel, the act of publishing a false, damaging statement about someone. If Wilde could prove Queensberry's accusation was false, he could clear his name completely and publicly, and Queensberry himself could face criminal punishment. The trial began in April 1895, with enormous public attention already fixed on Wilde thanks to his current theatrical success. Queensberry's legal team, however, had prepared something Wilde had not expected. Instead of simply denying wrongdoing, Queensberry's lawyers set out to prove the accusation was true, gathering witnesses and evidence about Wilde's private life, including testimony from several young men Queensberry's investigators had tracked down. Under intense cross-examination by Queensberry's lawyer, Edward Carson, Wilde's famous wit, which had charmed London society for over a decade, began to work against him. His clever, evasive answers, once celebrated on stage, now looked to the courtroom like a man dodging the truth rather than defending it. Within days, it became clear Wilde's case was collapsing entirely. His lawyers formally withdrew the prosecution, and Queensberry was found not guilty of libel. But no one, least of all Wilde, expected what happened next. The very evidence gathered to defend Queensberry was immediately handed to the public prosecutor. Wilde was arrested just days later, on April 6, 1895, at a London hotel, before he had any real chance to leave the country. He was charged with gross indecency, a criminal offense under British law at the time that criminalized private sexual conduct between men. His first criminal trial ended without a verdict, after the jury failed to agree. The government, unusually determined, brought Wilde to trial a second time, even though a second trial on the same facts was not the normal course of action. On May 25, 1895, Wilde was found guilty. The judge sentenced him to 2 years of hard labor, the maximum punishment the law allowed, and reportedly remarked that it was, in his view, too lenient a sentence for the crime. The most celebrated playwright in London was now a convicted prisoner. So let's return to our central question. How did the most famous, most celebrated writer in London collapse so completely in the very same year he reached his greatest success? The honest answer is that Wilde's fame, his wit, and the very qualities that made him beloved on stage offered him no protection at all once he stepped into a courtroom under a law built specifically to punish men like him. Hard labor, physically exhausting, often punishing manual work required of prisoners as part of their sentence. Wilde served his sentence at several prisons, including Pentonville and Wandsworth, before ending at Reading Gaol, where the harsh conditions badly damaged both his physical health and his spirit. Prisoners at the time were often kept in near total silence and isolation, a policy that took a severe psychological toll on a man who had built his entire identity around brilliant conversation. While still in prison, Wilde wrote a long, deeply personal letter addressed to Bosie, later published after his death under the title De Profundis. Posthumous happening, or published after a person's death. The letter reflected on suffering, betrayal, and what remained of his identity after such total public disgrace. Wilde was released in May 1897, but the England he returned to no longer welcomed him. His plays had been pulled from London stages the moment he was arrested, and his name had become a public scandal, a shocking event that severely damages someone's reputation. Even his wife Constance, still legally married to him, changed her surname and their son's surname to Holland, hoping to protect the boys from the weight of their father's disgraced name. He left England for continental Europe almost immediately, living the rest of his life in a kind of quiet exile, the state of living away from one's home country, often because it is unsafe or unwelcoming to return. He took on a new name, Sebastian Melmoth, to avoid being recognized. In 1898, he published The Ballad of Reading Gaol, a haunting poem reflecting directly on his prison experience and the suffering he witnessed there, including the execution of a fellow inmate. It remains one of his most powerful and personal works, strikingly different in tone from the light social comedies that had made him famous. Wilde's health, badly weakened by his time in prison, never fully recovered. He died on November 30, 1900, in a modest Paris hotel room, reportedly from meningitis linked to an old ear infection, possibly worsened by the conditions of his imprisonment. He was 46 years old. A famous deathbed quip about the room's wallpaper is often attributed to him, though many biographers now consider it more legend than confirmed fact. He died in relative poverty, far from the packed London theaters that had once adored him, with only a handful of loyal friends by his side. For decades after his death, Wilde's conviction remained an unquestioned part of the official record, a permanent, official criminal mark against one of England's greatest writers, even as his plays quietly crept back onto stages and into classrooms over the following century. That finally began to change in 2017, when the British government passed a law posthumously pardoning men who had been convicted under historical laws criminalizing private conduct between men. The law is sometimes informally called Turing's Law, after the mathematician Alan Turing, who had faced a similar conviction decades after Wilde. Oscar Wilde was among the tens of thousands of men formally pardoned under that law, more than a century after his original conviction. Today, Wilde is remembered not primarily as a convicted criminal, but as one of the sharpest wits and finest playwrights the English language has ever produced, a reputation his own trial once seemed determined to erase completely. His plays are still performed constantly, all over the world, prized for exactly the same quick, brilliant wit that once dazzled Victorian London. The man who was once destroyed for who he loved is now celebrated for everything he wrote. If this story moved you, subscribe to Storied English for more true stories from history. Told in clear, simple English to help you learn while you watch. Comment to let us know which story do you want to hear next.